Story time.
John rubbed his tired eyes and looked at the clock on his computer's desktop. Just past 11. Leaning back in his chair, he stifled a yawn and thought back to earlier that day. Back to when his boss told him to stay late to finish an important report. John straightened up and fought to keep his eyelids from drooping, slapping his face gently.
Stay awake. Stay awake. Don't just finish this. I just need to stay awake.
Looking away from the glaring white spreadsheet in front of him, he dragged his weary gaze across his desk and noticed the red striped peppermint next to his keyboard. He picked up the cellophane-wrapped candy and eyed it, thinking back to when he had gotten it earlier that day. He arrived in the break room, desperate for some coffee, when he had noticed the unusual gift basket sitting on one of the tables inside. Approaching it, he picked up a gold-embossed card that simply said, "Help yourself." Looking around, he had intended to ask a coworker about the unusual basket. Seeing no one, he shrugged and took a single piece of peppermint candy for himself before grabbing his coffee and walking back to his desk. That had been a few hours ago, and he had forgotten entirely about the sweet treat until now.
Maybe this will help.
Taking the peppermint out of the wrapper, he popped it into his mouth and leaned forward, returning to work. Soon, his mouth was filled with that sweet and aromatic flavor of the treat as he swirled it around with his tongue. Completing the report, he saved it and sent it to his boss before looking at the clock again. It was now 11:30. Satisfied, John leaned back in his chair and stretched before the realization hit him. The peppermint was still in his mouth, completely solid and undissolved. Curious, John tentatively swirled it around in his mouth before placing it between his teeth and biting down. Pain flared in his molars as the peppermint failed to give way, feeling like a hard rock in his mouth. John reached for a nearby decorative ashtray he had never used and moved to spit it out, but realized with horror that his mouth would not open, no matter how hard he tried. His lips were sealed, completely shut. Shocked and with panic slowly starting to set in, he tried to peel his lips apart with his fingers, to no avail. Grabbing a tissue from a nearby dispenser, he tried rubbing it against his lips and failed again to part them. It was then that he heard it, a crack. It was loud enough to warrant his full attention, temporarily distracting him from his sealed lips. At first, he thought he had irreparably damaged one or more of his teeth from his bite, but then the cracking continued. A small cracking sound he heard from within his mouth. For a moment, John simply sat there, listening. Curious, he swirled his tongue around the peppermint in his mouth, feeling cracks in the surface of it and some small chunks missing.
But it doesn't make sense. It shouldn't be cracking after being bitten. It should have cracked a while.
It was then he felt it, or rather, them. Small, little protrusions from within the peppermint, feeling like sharp little twigs. He slowly moved his tongue across one of the protrusions. It twitched. John gagged, disgust and fear washing over him. He ran to the office restroom and tried his best to pry his mouth open, but it still wouldn't give. By now, the protrusions were writhing, and he could feel pieces of the candy sitting in various pockets within his mouth, its mostly shattered form still lying on his tongue. John turned the restroom faucet on full blast, leaning into the sink and letting water rush over his lips, then getting some soap from the wall dispenser and rubbing it vigorously against them. They still would not part. John froze, his lips still under the running water as he felt movement in his mouth. Pieces of the candy now scattered all around, and a prickly, multi-legged form stood dead in the center of it. Its clawed legs splayed out against the walls and ceiling of his mouth as it balanced there, like a half-open umbrella in a tube. Time seemed to stand still as fear gripped John's heart, dread building in his stomach. Ragged breath after ragged breath entered through his flared nostrils, and his breathing intensified. At first, the creature seemed to simply remain there, as if waiting for something, and as John sucked in a breath, he felt it turn and move towards his throat. John gagged involuntarily as he struggled to expel the foreign invader through his sealed lips. Desperately, he tried to push against it with his tongue, trying to crush the creature. However, As if it had expected this, he felt it push back with surprising strength as it slowly crawled closer and closer to the back of his throat, itching its way along while pressing back against his tongue. John was in full panic mode now, trying to push his fingers in between his lips to peel them apart, yet as hard as he tried, they would not give. He clawed at his lips, red scratches appearing before him as he watched himself in the restroom mirror. It was then a thought struck him, and he pushed his hand into his pocket, fishing around before pulling out something he had always carried around with him, but never once thought he would ever resort to using in such a way. His hand trembled as he opened his clenched fist. His trusty pocket knife lay folded in his palm, gleaming in the fluorescent light of the office restroom. Hesitantly, he flicked it open. Its sharp blade shone with a mirrored polish in the light of the restroom, daring him to use it.
I can't.
The creature now was in the back of his throat, causing John to cough and gag violently. His body was doing its best to fight and expel the creature, but his mouth remained shut. He eyed the blade one last time before turning it on his lips. John looked over the data on the screen of his monitor, sighing with satisfaction before saving it and sending it to his boss. Wearily, he looked at the clock in the center of his screen, just before 5. Standing up and stretching, he shuddered a bit in relief that flooded into his tired muscles. John made his way towards the kitchen, shuffling towards the fridge in his sandals as his stomach growled. Just as he was about to open the door, he heard his doorbell ring.
Huh? I didn't order any packages recently. Somebody visited. No one called.
He made his way to his front door and slowly opened it. The front porch stood empty, not a soul in sight. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed something on his doormat, and John looked down. His blood ran cold as his heart skipped a beat. Frantically, he looked up, searching for any clue as to who could have left this here, but there was nothing. No delivery truck nearby, no one around that could have left it here. John slowly looked back down at the package that waited on his doormat. Idly, his tongue ran over the scars on his lips. His eye twitched as he reached an especially long and deep one that ran lengthwise across his once intact lips. The memory flooded back into his mind, the strong smell of disinfectant used in the bathroom, the sticky sensation of blood as it poured from his ruined mouth, the taste of it as he nearly drowned in his own viscous red fluid. He remembered the pain from the jagged slash that finally allowed him to access his mouth. He remembered reaching inside and pulling out the creature, no, the invader. The way it squirmed as it fought the grip of his hand, all spiky legs and hard, the prickly exoskeleton. He remembered throwing it on the restroom floor and stomping it until nothing remained but a dark green stain. He remembered collapsing against the sink afterward before treating his wound with a paper towel and calling 911. The rest was a bit of a blur after that. He vaguely remembered being all but forced to resign, with no evidence of the creature being found in the restroom afterward. How recommendations for psychological evaluation were being pushed onto him, and how he had found another job that allowed him to work from home, and how he desperately wanted to simply move on and forget that any of that had ever happened. But he couldn't forget. And now, as the ghostly taste of peppermint invaded his mouth, John felt utter repulsion and betrayal as his stomach growled once again at that sweet smell wafting from the gift basket before him. Large, brightly covered rainbow swirl lollipops, huge chocolate bars, and of course, multiple cellophane-wrapped peppermints all lay in a nest of crinkled green plastic grass. Within the basket, neatly placed in front of all the confectionery treats, lay a lone, gold-embossed card with a single word written on it.
Enjoy.
Thanks for watching.